Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or whenever you should happen to find this. Welcome to the Quote of Arms podcast, where we talk about our favorite Magic the Gathering tribes. Today I am joined by...
Hi, everyone. My name is Trent.
Hi, Trent. What tribe are we going to describe today?
Today we'll be talking about rogues.
Awesome. And they certainly have passage to a lot of different places.
Yes, they do. One of the best lands out there, right?
Oh, absolutely. So, one of the best lads talking about one of the best lands. So, where might people have heard of you before?
So you might have seen some of my article series over at EDH I did a series called Evasive Maneuvers, which looked at different keywords and strategies for evasion and see how we might be able to implement them and evaluate them in the context of Commander. And then I'm doing a new series now called Reconstruct History, where I look at different archetypes or cards or card types over time and really look at how their popularities might change or increase and decrease with the printing of new different cards and power creep and things like that.
Interesting, and certainly plenty coming out with the new Kamigawa with different card types than people might have been expecting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we have a fairly kind of, limited scope. We usually look at a 2-year window from kind of today in the last 2 years, but we're really just trying to get a kind of a live reading on different cards as they're kind of shifting in popularity over the course of the last 2 years. And so as we get more and more products kind of coming out there, part of our interest is to really track how people's evaluations of those cards might be changing and weigh those things with things like price or power creep or maybe other options or even some commanders that come out that make certain cards, suddenly very popular. We see that with like Feather, for example. So that's kind of the goal of the series there.
Yeah, it's always awesome to see new life be breathed into existing cards and archetypes. One of the things that could also be interesting is seeing how new content creators in the scene and some of their new perspectives can shape things as well.
Absolutely. One of the things that kind of got me interested in the series was to look at different content creators mentioning specific commanders or even doing gameplay videos of commanders on YouTube series or something like that and doing well and seeing if we could actually see upticks in the data as a result of that. And we definitely do see that happening at EDH which is pretty cool. It shows that there's actually a really good influence oftentimes, which I think is awesome.
Well, maybe one of these days I'll make Unsummon a chase card.
There we go. Yeah. Hey, I love Unsummon. I'm a big fan of it.
And Unsummon loves you too. Because it is my favorite card, and I go by Unsummon Skull. Oh man. So, we're here to discuss rogues today. You devilish rogue. Making me blush over here. Okay. So, usually we start off with a more cursory glance at what rogues are like. So, from a gameplay mechanical perspective, what are rogues like?
Yeah, the way I would kind of characterize rogues, at least in the way they manifest oftentimes in Magic the Gathering, is usually identified by things like sleuth or guile. They're often kind of sneaky, and they tend to really prioritize combat or some sort of what I would often call a saboteur effect. So this is where there's a combat damage trigger that gets put on the stack if that creature deals combat damage. And that could create some sort of trigger that might either harm the defending player or maybe even benefit you in some capacity. So Thada Adel, Acquisitor, is kind of a, maybe a classic one in this case. She's a merfolk rogue. And when she deals combat damage to a player, you can search someone's library for, an artifact and cast it. Oftentimes in EDH, we often joke that she's just kind of the Soul Ring Acquisitor. But I think she has a very potent kind of saboteur effect. And we often see those kinds of effects typically tacked onto rogues. And often to help facilitate those saboteur kind of triggers, they typically prioritize evasion. So, they're pretty low to the ground typically, but they often are quite evasive in some capacity.
One of the things that came up recently, I just did the, as I'm sure you're aware, because I also write for EDH Rec, I just did the blue set review
Yeah.
of Kamigawa just last night. It was interesting that there are a couple of cards that actually trigger off of either ninjas or rogues because ninjas share that characteristic of dealing combat damage and gaining an additional effect. Usually because they've managed to sneak through using their ninjutsu ability.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ninjas, if anything, have gotten really even probably more potent saboteur effects, maybe more than a lot of rogues maybe lately. I think in part because of Kamigawa, but they've also just expanded the ninja pool since the original Kamigawa with things like Modern Horizons and other sets. Of course, Yuriko printed in the Aminatsu kind of commander product. So ninjas have definitely gotten a lot of support in the last few years, which has been exciting to see. But I think you hit the nail on the head. They do overlap quite a bit with rogues, and I was also interested to see some of these cards in Kamigawa and the Undying Sea that have some sort of lord effect or benefit for both rogues and ninjas, which is kind of interesting. It shows that they're really that Studio X and Wizards of the Coast is really kind of lumping them or affiliating them fairly closely.
Yeah, well, their abilities were kind of similar to each other. Um,
Absolutely.
uh, that is actually where one of my biggest disappointments with rogues the last time they came up with as a supported type, which I believe was it Ikoria, I think. Blue black rogues was an archetype.
A little bit, yeah. I think they were kind of teasing here and there. They had some in the core set. I think the Thieves Guild Master, if I remember correctly, was in the core set.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, Zendikar Rising really kind of is where you see a massive blossom in rogue support, in part because I think the party mechanic,
Yeah.
which helped to kind of round out these particular 5 tribes a bit more, and rogues happen to be featured in that case, and so I think that's where you see a big uptick for sure.
Yeah, that's where I was really disappointed with how rogues were handled with that because I really was hoping that they would bring back the mechanic of skulk.
Yeah, I personally am a big fan of Skulk. I know it's only got, if I remember correctly, I wrote one of my evasive maneuvers articles was on Skulk, and I think I remember it's only on like 13 or 20 creatures or something like that.
It's on an
Uh,
enchantment as well.
yeah, and it's kind of funny that I think that's behind enemy lines, right, or something like that is the enchantment.
I
Uh,
have it in my Tesa token, my Tesa spirit stack. Let me take a
yeah,
look real quick.
and I think it's an interesting mechanic, and considering rogues are so low to the ground, it would be kind of conducive to Skulk. I think a lot of people associate rogues with unblockability, and I think for a large portion of Studio X's design of rogues, that's definitely the case. But we can see a bit of a change in the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years, and that's I think in part because Studio X seems to be trending away from straight unblockability. They don't
Mm-hmm.
really want to have any more invisible stalkers running around. And Mark Rosewater in particular has gone on record on Blogatog and said they really weren't a fan of the design of just straight unblockability because it tended to make for pretty uninteractive combat steps, which makes sense. So I'm with you in that Skulk at least adds a level of interesting dimension, and you have to kind of
Mm-hmm.
play around it a bit more.
Oh yeah, especially in it would have been especially cool in a set with mutating these giant monsters. How is it that small creatures or people are able to survive? It would have been cool to see them just kind of running around and able to take things down despite giant monsters existing.
Yeah, sure, exactly. And I think it just fits flavorfully too, right? Rogues
Mm-hmm.
kind of skulk about. We see, historically, there were a lot of kind of one-off rogues, I would say, by nowadays standards, originally printed, going back to like Aladdin and Alibaba and Grave Robbers. And, at the time, WotC decided to kind of lump them all into the rogue archetype in the Mirrodin block around 2003. And that's really with Nurok Stealth Suit is this kind of foray into the rogue tribe that kind of linked thieves, spies, robbers, etc. But Skulk just kind of feels in flavor with what rogues are and what they do. And like you said, they kind of go under, right? You want to go under the larger threats that are kind of romping around. And I think that's very in line with what rogues kind of thematically and flavorfully could be aligned with mechanically in the game.
Yeah, I mean, especially because it works mechanically and thematically with them. I was kind of hoping to see more of that because, well, especially because they already have unblockable as a major element of their identity. Little guys who can't be blocked.
Yeah.
Then you throw in that they do something when they hit, and that's a lot of what rogues are. Even if you look at the precon, that's kind of what they were there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, I think they've definitely nailed some of the evasion portion, but I think there's still some work to be done here and there. And I've been excited to see more rogues with things like Death Touch,
Mm-hmm.
because I do think that can be a form of evasion, but they can also hang back as blockers and be kind of rattlesnakes. And I like that kind of component that they feel almost more assassin like in that regard.
Well,
And
that's where you run into the difficulty, because assassin is its own type.
exactly, right. Yeah, exactly. And so I get that assassins tend to be more aligned with, black and death touch and killing, but I do kind of like this idea of death touch as a more, you have to consider it, right? It creates agency in the combat step that blockers and the defending player, or you as the blocking player, it starts to create decision making in combat, which I like. Whereas straight unblockability or even Triton shore stalkers are usually just gonna swing until they die or get removed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they encourage a sort of narrow-mindedness, not really having, or not really those decision that are, so not really resulting in decision making, except insofar as sometimes you want them to block, or sometimes you don't.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe this is my kind of importing flavor of what I associate with rogues from other kind of fantasy realms into it. But when you think about even things like D&D or other fantasy archetypes that feature rogues you have to be kind of careful when you're making your decisions, because you don't usually have this massive kind of health pool or anything like that. You have to be very calculated in when you're doing something. And I like that if that makes itself manifest in the game in things like combat, as opposed to unblockable, just makes you feel like you're almost unstoppable unless they happen to just remove you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, maybe one of the things that could have been done to create some nuance to them, if you're going to remain with the unblockable type things, could have been returning to some of the shadow synergies, which were the creatures attacking it as unblocked. You can redirect, or you can choose not to deal damage and instead do some other effect.
Oh yeah, I like that idea.
That might have been an interesting way to go with it as well.
Yeah, there's the Soltari, some of those Soltari white shadow creatures that, like you said, have that kind of saboteur effect where they're evasive, but you can forego the life loss to gain some other sort of on damage trigger or proc, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I just always think that's interesting because, like you said, it fosters more agency and decision making. And I just like that. It makes sense for rogues to me, as opposed to just kind of swinging wildly and swinging for the fences and just trying to, hammer on life totals.
Mm-hmm. So they're little guys who are unblockable. Sometimes they have saboteur type effects, but it's in addition to the damage for the most part, not instead of the damage, which might have been a cool way to adjust some of their identity, or at least some of their playability. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
what else are rogues kind of known for?
I think, and this really, I think, comes more in the Zendikar Rising set, particularly with this, the sneak attack precon with Anawan the Ruin Thief. They get tethered pretty closely with incidental mill as almost as part of their saboteur effect or their combat damage, that they're incidentally milling libraries as they're dealing damage to life
Mm-hmm.
totals.
Yeah, and the commanders that work with them kind of do that too. Um, is there a particular commander that you're thinking of?
Yeah, I mean, aside from maybe Anawan the Ruin Thief himself, which is kind of it has absolutely dominated since its printing. The rogue archetype. There's
So,
over, I think, 4,300 decks or something like that on
so you've
EH
mentioned
right
Anowon
now.
the Ruin Thief a couple of times. What does he do?
Yeah, so I'm going to pull it up here just so I make sure I don't missay it. But Anawan the Ruin Thief is a legendary creature vampire rogue. It is 2 generic mana as well as a blue and a black. And it says other rogues you control get +1/+1. So already off the bat, that's pretty important because rogues themselves have not typically had any sort of lord effects. And so their damage has been pretty measly when you translate it into something like Commander, right? In a 20 life format, you might be able to kind of get away with a couple little 1/1 unblockables that are chipping away, or even 2/1 unblockables or something. But in a 40 life format, or really when you're up against 120 cumulative life points for all 3 of your opponents, that starts to become a big ask. So the anthem definitely helps. And then he says, whenever 1 or more rogues you control deal combat damage to a player, that player mills a card for each 1 damage dealt to them. If the player mills at least 1 creature card this way, you may draw a card. And he is a 2/4 in terms of his power and toughness.
So, ports the milling strategy, is a lord, has strong defensive stats, and can draw a card.
Right. Yes.
That is something worth noting. If it mills multiple creatures, it only draws the 1 card.
Right, which I think is fine. It's reined in that sense, which is fine. It I do think it pushes rogues in my opinion, it pushes rogues in a difficult space because you're trying to simultaneously now hit people's life total as well as their library. And I will say firsthand, I love rogues. I love chatting about rogues and thinking about them. But I don't have an Anawan deck, and I think in part because just in my play group and meta, I could not afford to mill some of my opponents without just absolutely furthering their own strategies. So I think it would work if I already happened to dedicate numerous slots to a lot of graveyard hate effects. But now I'm getting pulled in a lot of different directions. I'm trying to develop rogues, attack with them, buff them up, mill, but also exile the cards I'm milling so that my opponents don't use those to, to their benefit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and unfortunately, some of the major ways that you would, or that you would deal with the graveyard, like scavenging ooze, or like, the new white scavenging ooze, are not in color.
Right. Yeah. And I think it just ends up becoming you have to put, there's some cards in there that are low opportunity cost, scavenger grounds. I think Planar Void is particularly good with Anawan because they still mill the card, but then Planar Void. So Planar Void is a 1 black mana enchantment that just says whenever a card we put into a graveyard, exile it. So that means it's actually triggered rather than a replacement effect, which means the cards are still hitting the graveyard and getting milled, but then they're getting exiled after that. That would work well with Anawan, but your card pool starts to become somewhat more limited. And again, now your deck is, in my opinion, getting pulled in a couple different directions if you happen to be in a meta that adores filling their graveyard and reanimating things, which I just happen to be in.
Mm-hmm.
I think they can do well too. I think the mill, I don't want to say the mill is all bad. I think there are some interesting payoffs, but what's interesting to me is a lot of the payoffs aren't including rogues. So it would be something like Sir Conrad, or Duskmantle Guildmage, right? These are non-rogue tribal cards, which if you're not a purist, it's fine. Definitely throw Sir Conrad in your deck, and it'll help with if you're running Anawan the Ruin Thief in the command zone. But it just is interesting because you have to start including, at least for now, oftentimes non-rogues to help with this kind of incidental mill payoff that Anawan's wanting you to kind of go down.
Yeah, incidental mill is something that I've heard discussed before because mill as a strategy can be difficult to pull off in a 100 card format because of how much you have to do. But incidental mill is something where if you design your deck to take better advantage of it than an opponent, you can wind up doing some really nasty things, like with Rexiel, if you're trying to make it an incidental mill deck. Now the question is, at what point does it become an incidental mill deck and no longer a rogue deck?
Absolutely, and I think that's something I've struggled with, and why I still kind of haven't ever put in my case an Anawan list in particular to paper. I definitely think there's other cool options in that same set. In Zendikar Rising, we got Zareth San, who kind of has a almost ninjutsu-y style rogue ability, and I think that's definitely a cool option there. And yeah, I think there could be some really neat ways you can take advantage of that mill. Absolutely. And I think Memory Plunder, for example, is one of my favorite cards. It's a hybrid blue black, blue black, blue black, blue black for an instant, and you just get to cast any spell out of someone's graveyard for free.
Nice.
And just it's an awesome card, and it works kind of well in that shell. But you have to hopefully have gotten there first, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I will say one of my favorite rogues as a commander is Sig River Cutthroat. Love
Yeah,
that card.
sure. Yeah, and I have a Sig deck as well. I will say I had played rogues back in the Lorwyn block, which is really, I think, where they kind of take off and crystallize as an archetype.
Mm-hmm.
We get the kind of blue black rogues there, and particularly with things like Una and Bitter Blossom, and Sig, of course, is the legendary. And I probably, like many other people, ran a Sig River Cutthroat rogue tribal deck for
Oh,
a while.
nice. And
I
Prowl is nice too.
Yeah, sure. The issue I ran into with Sig as a rogue tribal commander is that the way Sig is worded. So Sig is a hybrid blue black legendary creature merfolk rogue with a 1/3 power and toughness, and it says at the beginning of each end step, if an opponent has lost 3 or more life this turn, you may draw a card. Pretty simple, and it makes sense, at surface level with rogues, because you can get in with these kinds of little evasive rogues, at least deal 3 damage, hit that threshold, and draw an extra card on your end step. The issue I ran into is it became kind of predictable and honestly sometimes difficult to close out a game. It honestly became dig for Notorious Throng, so you get an extra turn with all your rogues. Otherwise, it was just kind of incidental damage. And I do think sometimes just having these little 1/1 unblockables or 2/2 unblockables constantly hitting people with saboteur effects has a kind of psychological recourse that people just get annoyed. Even if they've only taken total of 8 damage, it's just every turn they're getting hit for these little cuts, and they could just be like, "Yeah, this is annoying. I'm just going to board wipe you or something." So I ran into trouble with consistency there, and it became kind of linear. Where I think Sig shines is an awesome commander as a rogue, but not for rogue tribal, is actually Sig is a group hug or group slug commander, and that's what I run him now, because his trigger can happen on every opponent's end step, and if you run rogue tribal, you're only really hitting that threshold in the combat step when you're attacking, whereas he can trigger on every end step if you're forcing people to lose life on their turns as well, and you start drawing 4 cards a turn cycle rather than only 1.
Yeah. See, what I loved about Sig as a rogue commander is that you can draw cards for doing nothing. That really felt roguelike to me, that you were able to pit your opponents politically against each other and profit from their squabbling without having to put forth any effort necessarily. That to me felt like the flavor of what I picture a rogue to be.
Sure, yeah, and I think that fits even within the kind of broader, I'm going to say, Dimir kind of flavor. I don't mean necessarily just the Ravnica Guild, but I do think a lot of the guild itself of Dimir in Ravnica is kind of, pitting people against each other. I think there's a lot of kind of pulling strings and politics there, and I would love to see more of that personally, not only as just a Dimir lover, but I think it would be cool to have even some more of those almost goat effects or something like that in blue black. I think that fits, and that would be kind of interesting, almost saboteur potential with rogues, in my opinion at least.
So that's where I went with my Sig.
Cool.
When I look at a commander, I'm not sure if you've seen my columns yet, but I look for critical mass of functional reprints. and how I can get those to work together to reduce variance, not necessarily to make my deck better or stronger, but to make it more reliable at doing the thing I want it to do.
Sure.
So, Sign in Blood was one of my favorite political cards for a while. Uh, you can target yourself and lose the 2 life, and just have it be a divination that hurts you but is a little cheaper. Or you can have it be a burn spell, or you can have it be a group hug style card, where somebody needs the cards, but you say, well, as long as you take some damage. So there have been a lot of those printed recently, and quite a lot of them have flown under the radar because they're black commons. But currently, there are about 13 functional reprints of Sign in Blood, and at least 10, probably 11 or 12, that specifically target. They don't specify it has to be you. And
Yeah, I think that leverage. I think I remember you talking about this in one of your articles, and I love the idea there because it's something like you said. There's actually flexibility there.
mhm,
It's just a lot of people, I think, still trend towards building their decks to serve them and them only,
mhm,
whereas things can get really fun. And part of the opportunity, and for me at least personally, the draw of Commander is the multiplayer interactive component, and having cards that, yes, most of the time I could use this on myself when I need to dig, but there's all these really cool flex points I can use it. And with something like Sig, as long as they hit that threshold of 3 life, I actually still get a card anyways.
yeah,
So yeah, I might be giving an opponent 2 cards, but they're also losing life. I
mhm,
might be able to even curry favor with that person, and I still get a card in the process.
yeah. So it's my Sig Burn deck. So all of the card draw in the deck can target an opponent and can cause loss of life.
Yeah, that's sweet. That honestly sounds somewhat similar to mine as well. We should definitely compare lists at some point
Sure.
because I just still see so many. You can see it on the EDH rec page, right? A
hmm
lot of the Sig decks out there are still definite, like very combat oriented rogue tribal, and I think that's
hmm
fine. Go for it. I just think there's actually a lot more interesting potential there that often just gets masked. I think by this legacy that Sig has long had as the rogue commander. Now, Anawan has kind of
hmm
shaken things up a bit, but I still think Sig's potential as a rogue is interesting, and like you said, there's kind of a flavor there that isn't necessarily 100% about combat. It's actually more, almost politicking or extorting and things like that, and being tricksy. And I feel like that's very much in flavor with rogues.
I like to think of it as psychological manipulation,
Sure.
using
Yeah.
the knowledge acquisition of blue uh, with the power and manipulation of black.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that just fits well with the, again, not just the guild, but the kind of the flavor of Demir more generally.
hmm
Uh, and not really going the mill route, which so often is what Demir gets kind of associated with. But I really like that there's this kind of potential to almost attach yourself with and from opponents by using something like Sig and these kinds of burn effects or draw effects politically, which I think is just awesome.
So yeah, there's a couple of different cool directions, and just because something is a rogue doesn't mean it has to have a lot of members of the tribe there for it to behave like a rogue.
Exactly. And I think that's definitely for me the takeaway is that rogues, a lot of tribal decks tend to kind of amass a critical mass of members of that tribe and gain benefits from those, right? In terms of elves, you might get not only lord effects, but mana generation, etc. But with rogues, I can see where that is definitely still the case, and in many kind of rogue tribalists, you might be able to do that. But in other cases, you can do some interesting things that are rogue-like without necessarily needing to have a large 25 plus creature slot of rogues in the list.
Yeah, generally speaking, when I'm making when I'm making tribal decks, I'll put about 20 members of the tribe in there and see if I can get a few that are doing other jobs that the deck needs. Like there are some satyrs that happen to destroy artifacts too. That
Sure.
helps me get the numbers up there because they're not just doing whatever it is that the tribe does that works towards winning the game. They're also doing the jobs that the deck needs to be a functional deck.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and you can try to find rogues that do things like that. Like maybe you put Sig in your deck as a card draw spell and not necessarily as a rogue in terms of winning the game because you need a critical mass of unblockable creatures in order to make sure that Sig continues to draw cards.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And there's flexibility there, which I like, and I think there are some aspects of those rogue. I think in the last 2 years, I would say, particularly, we've gotten an expansion of what rogues can do. I think there's definitely the kind of low to the ground, evasive, attacky rogues that we've kind of talked about already. But I do think there have been some really interesting design spaces in other rogues and what they can kind of offer in terms of their abilities. One of the ones I think of is Prowling Geist Catcher, which I'm going to just make sure I read the card here, is 3 and a black for a creature, human rogue. And it says, whenever you sacrifice another creature, exile it. If that creature was a token, put a +1/+1 counter on Prowling Geist Catcher. And then when Prowling Geist Catcher leaves the battlefield, return each card exiled with it to the battlefield under your control. This is kind of interesting because it's like a board wipe insurance, but also could lean you into aristocrats in this case. And I think that's a kind of interesting design space. Eloise, Nefalia's Sleuth, is a rogue, and that's not really looking to develop a critical mass of rogues in attack, but maybe use some of these more tricksy, almost aristocratic rogues to do so.
Yeah, I can see that. And that's where people underestimate how much blue can do in terms of aristocrats. I actually made a mono blue aristocrats deck.
Oh, cool. Who's the commander? Do you mind if I ask?
The original Baron.
Okay, Talarian Wizard?
Something like that. Master, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, I never made that. When they did the remake of Baron, that I like his. He would be like the commander for an unsummoned tribal deck. That just seemed
Yeah.
too on the nose to me.
Sure.
But the first one was interesting because you can pay mana to sacrifice a permanent, any kind of permanent. So that's where the hatching plans combo can come in.
Okay.
Because you sacrifice that and draw a bunch of cards. There's Oculus, where you could draw cards when it dies. There's Vivisection, sack a creature, draw 3 cards, I believe. So
Yeah, that's cool.
blue has a lot of support for aristocrats type strategies that people don't really look into. I actually built that deck as sort of an homage to Peter Mono Whiteboarder.
Okay.
Because he loves those incremental advantage decks, and especially aristocrat style decks, even though I'm not as big a fan of them.
Sure.
And of course, because there has to be a big bang win in there somewhere, because I love to win games that way. I have Dance of the Dragons, I believe.
Okay, yeah, that's a sweet card.
Just turn them all into 5/5s.
Yeah.
All these incremental bodies, yeah, I'll just turn them all into 5/5s and bash.
And it kind of becomes an overrun style effect, right? In that case, which is sweet. You're effectively buffing them, especially if you're running something small and low to the ground. You're almost buffing them by 4 power on average in that case.
Yeah. And it gives more ways to just go outside of the color pie from what blue should be allowed to do.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
And you're able to find ways to break the color pie or find unique interactions like that. Those can be really powerful. But again, that goes back to when I'm building a deck, I look for a critical mass of similar effects.
Yeah, and I think it just speaks to to me, the enjoyment I also get out of just brewing monocolored decks, because you are limiting yourself in terms of color pie. So you end up trying to force yourself into kind of creative spaces to solve these issues that are normally much more solvable in a multicolored deck by just slotting something in, right? If I'm in blue-green, I might have a bigger potential to draw cards off of casting creatures or having them enter the battlefield with Beast Whisperer or Guardian Project,
Hmm.
or remove particular permanent types with Nature's Claims. But if I suddenly don't have access to those cards and colors, you get kind of pushed into creative spaces, and I always enjoy that in terms of what monocolored decks can help bring.
Yeah, I actually had a gameplay series. It was a short series, just 5 episodes, but I'm working on making a couple more seasons of it on my YouTube channel, where you go around the color pie, where everybody's playing the same monocolor,
Oh,
going
that sounds like a lot
in
of fun.
going in Uber
I like
order.
that idea.
And we're continuing another run around the color pie. I think we've done white, blue, we're on to black, I believe. Yeah, we're on to black this week. I'll be streaming that tomorrow night.
Well, I'll definitely try to check it out tomorrow. I enjoy those kinds of not only builds and what monocolor brings, but also those kinds of structured games or gameplays where everyone kind of comes to the table with a particular build or set of restrictions and parameters. I think those can
Hmm.
always be fun.
Yeah, and the nice thing is, because I do my stream signups weeks ahead of time, you can either get the deck together if you need to, or if you have the deck ready when you're or when you need to have it set or have your setup ready and such, and you can just plan it ahead of time.
Yeah, that's cool.
So that's coming up. So they're primarily in blue and black. Is there a particular color you'd lean them in, like a little bit more blue than black?
Yeah, I got some kind of basic data here from, so there's roughly 300 at the time that we're recording this, so this is really Kamigawa Neon Dynasties just kind of getting spoiled now.
Mm-hmm.
336 commander legal rogues, 32 of which can be your commander, and as you said, vast majority are in blue and black. About 32% of rogues are blue and 38 are black. After that it's red, 21%, and then it kind of drops off from there into the other colors. And so they're primarily in Grixis. I have experimented with Grixis rogues, and that was pretty fun. I ended up using not Queen Marchesa, sorry, Marchesa the Black Rose in that case.
Mm-hmm.
I liked that she added 1/1 counters, which was helping for them to get on this kind of faster clock of hitting people's life totals. On top of that, there's actually quite a few fun rogues in red, mainly from the kind of older portions of Magic's history, but even some more recent ones. And then red also gave access to things like double strike granters, which I really liked. So Berserker's Onslaught or Rage Reflection was really interesting because, as we talked about, a lot of rogues have these saboteur effects, and to double up on those was particularly fun. So getting to do kind of 2 triggers on combat damage for Thada Adel, or for me, one of my favorite mechanic of all time is Cipher, which is you can cast the card and then encode it onto a creature, and whenever that creature deals combat damage, you get to cast a copy of the card. But now if you get double strike, you get double cast copies. So there's definitely some fun potential there. Marchesa also kind of provides incidental board wipe insurance because if they get the 1/1 counters, they get to come back. So it was fun. It definitely was a bit slow and lumbering, though. It takes a bit to get off the ground, but it was a kind of fun design space to think through and brew through.
Yeah, I can certainly.
Aside from that, I think there's some kind of notable rogues in other colors that you might not think at first glance. Yisan, the Wanderer Bard, is a rogue
Mm-hmm.
who's a mono green who kind of does a semi. I don't want to say birthing pod, but it's kind of similar. You kind of work your way up with these verse counters. Guafa Hazid in Azorius is a really cool rogue, and it's I think it is the only rogue in Azorius to date. And it feels very roguelike. It's kind of doing this bartering system and kind of politicking, which I think is, as we talked about earlier, similar to Sig, is kind of within the rogue flavor and sphere. It doesn't just have to be combat, which I like.
It's interesting to see a rogue in an identity that is lawful.
yeah, rogue and Azorius, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where it starts to dip into that lawful evil territory, which is something that I find interesting. I don't think I see that gone into enough in fantasy work, where They look at how can people use and exploit rules and loopholes to uh, further their own gains and possibly harm others.
Sure, yeah, and I think like you said, I think it's actually an interesting potential design space, right?
Hmm.
Gwafa Hazid I'll just read the card really quick. Gwafa Hazid, Profiteer, generic, blue, or white and a blue, so 3 mana value, legendary creature, human rogue. And for a white and a blue and a tap, you get to put a bribery counter on target creature you don't control. Its controller draws a card. And then creatures with bribery counters on them cannot attack or block. And the flavor text is everyone has a price, which I just love. And I
Hmm.
think you're right. There is this kind of, savviness to navigate bureaucratic, lawful enterprises and structures. And I think you can be roguish in those kinds of even bureaucratic or lawful structures. And I think Wafa Hazid helps kind of embody that a bit. It just, he happens to right now be kind of the only iteration of that.
Reminds me a bit of Dovin.
Which one?
Dovin Bond, the Planeswalker.
Ah, okay, yeah. From, yeah,
From
understood.
Kaladesh.
Yeah,
So again, kind of using exploiting the law systems to further their own personal gain, including just the reason for summoning the Gatewatch.
yeah. And I think, in the case of both some of Dovin's planeswalker abilities or loyalty abilities, as well as Wafa Hazid, it's a lot of it's like you said, it's really trying to manipulate and barter with people, or even just buy them off, which I like, and that can be very roguelike. Maybe I'm not going in the black sense and trying to hit a mark or assassinate or steal something, but I am trying to kind of buy people off for my own gain. That can definitely be sneaky and roguelike, which I like. I enjoy that kind of idea of design space, and I could definitely see in the future trying to kind of experiment, maybe even with Esper rogues in that sense.
Out of curiosity, um, are you a fan, say, of Game of Thrones?
Yeah, absolutely. I read all the books.
Nice. The ones that are out, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
we're still waiting on Winds of Winter, but yes, everything that's out.
I'm in the Midwest, but when the winter, I'll go outside. But still, so I wonder. See, to me, Sig plays a lot like the way that I would expect Petter Baelish to play out.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Yeah,
Like, not actually
uh,
even necessarily getting his own hands dirty.
yeah,
That's
and
that.
it's the kind of famous line he has, right? Like chaos is a ladder.
Hmm.
I'm benefiting when other people are losing, not necessarily me putting them there. Uh, and I think Sig can foster that again if you happen to have people going at each other or targeting each other, et cetera, or like you said, with some of these more bartering kind of cards or political cards that can also chip away at their life totals. That definitely feels Peter Baelish. Yeah, I like that.
My first attempt at Sig years ago was a Storm deck.
Huh.
Where what I did was, because there weren't a lot of commanders out then, this was shortly after Commander became a format.
Okay.
So what I would do is just sculpt my hand while people were attacking each other, and then boom.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you say that. Mine is definitely not Storm, but it does something that I think I personally identify with Demir, which is this idea that you kind of go under the radar and you're a bit cryptic throughout the course of the game. You're definitely in the game and you can interact and remove things and counterspell things or draw cards. That's kind of what Blue and Black is shines at. But I really like this idea of kind of laying low and then things start to kind of ramp up or hit this crescendo, which not in the red sense of maybe being all the way explosive all the time, but
You just
I
start off cryptic, and then over time you start commanding a presence.
exactly. And the way the way I built mine was it's different because I think a lot of when I used to have Sig as a rogue tribal combat commander, it was the opposite. It was everything's out early, turn 3, I already have 3 or 4 creatures out and I'm attacking and kind of annoying people. Whereas now my deck is kind of flipped and it doesn't do a lot early and it just kind of slowly puts out a little piece that says when you do X action, you're probably going to have some sort of life effect tacked onto that. But then I can, cast Mirror Maid and copy that, or copy Enchantment or Estrid's Invocation. And so suddenly I have 3 Underworld Dreams out or 4 Underworld Dreams out. And every time someone draws 1 card, they lose 4 life or something. And like you said, it's incremental in that way, which I like. And to me, that kind of feels calculated. It feels Dimir-y, for lack of a better word.
So speaking of being Dimir-y and being kind of sneaky, I did say that they start off cryptic and then they start to command a presence.
Well done.
There we go.
I definitely went over my head. Well done.
Yeah, that's okay. It's okay. I'm an English and history teacher. I have to make terrible jokes.
No, that's a good one. I totally missed that.
Nah, that was terrible. Okay. So it's not a joke, is how good rogues can be if they're in the right shell. And there are actually some interesting ways to build around some of their abilities, like the unblockable part can go... So rogues can slot themselves into intriguing places. You can put them into, say, Edric Spymaster at Trest and start drawing a bunch of cards. You can even go Sultai and and use some different effects that way. For going into Oathbreaker, I have an Oathbreaker deck that uses a biogenetic mutation as a signature spell. So I spend the first few turns making these unblockable creatures, and then I put out the commander. Then the next turn, a biogenetic mutation, make my creatures into like 5/5s, and they're all unblockable.
That's cool. Right on. Yeah.
One of my commander decks that I just recently got a Poke Altar for is Tanazir Quandrix. Poke Altar is Flygon actually holding a Trapinch to show that it's putting the energy into him.
That's neat. I like that. That's a pretty flavorful art too. Like out of all the Pokemon, I think Tanazir could be. I think Flygon hits the mark.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, especially with all the crystals that were in the original because of the fractals.
Yeah.
The diamond-shaped wings and such. But the way the deck plays out is, again, small, evasive creatures that get pumped because that's what Tanazir does. It gives your creatures base power and toughness equal to Tanazir's current power and toughness.
Right, yeah.
With that deck, I have dealt well over 1,000 damage with Overwhelming Stampede.
Oof, that's wild.
Well, the creatures got pumped, and then the base power and toughness got changed because Tanazir got pumped.
Yeah, it just kind of ratcheted from there.
Yeah. Because they still have the pump layer over the top of the changed power and toughness layer.
Yeah. I think green actually, I mean, there's kind of tropes about how good green is in Commander, of course, but I think it actually slots very well and is very conducive to what rogues, the combat kind of orientation of rogues want, right? Mm-hmm. You get access to things like Overrun effects or Beastmaster Ascension or these 1/1 counters. I know some people who've definitely converted their Sig River Cutthroat decks or Anawan decks over to Ukima and Kazur as partners. And even though neither of them are rogues, they reward a lot of smaller unblockable creatures incrementally growing, and therefore kind of putting increased pressure on life totals as the game goes on. And those green cards aren't limited to specific tribes, right? You can slot in a Beastmaster Ascension in an Edric deck that's largely chock full of rogues, and it detract from the theme of what you're trying to do, which is nice.
So there's different ways to alter what they're doing. In terms of going into, say, red, that's where you start getting these small unblockable creatures, but there's the red enchantment that gives creatures +1/+0 for each attacking creature that shares a creature type with it.
Yeah, shared animosity. Yeah.
And that's one way because it's a power changing effect. You can start off with the because they're small creatures attacking, using the pinger or using the enchantments that deal damage when a small creature attacks.
Yeah, your raid bombardment kind of cavalcade of
Hmm.
calamity effects. Yeah,
And then put the power toughness change on.
absolutely. And you get access to some really cool rogues in red too. I mean, Grenzo Havoc Razor, even though it's right now very expensive, it's such a cool card for those kinds of shells because it rewards you getting in for damage. It's a rogue itself, and you then get modularity with each creature you deal damage with. So the wider you go, the more triggers you get from Grenzo. And then you can choose, do I want to exile the top card of their library and try to disrupt their library or their plans or even cast something off of it? Or do I want to goad creatures and have them start going elsewhere, which will only facilitate even more kind of damage that you'll be able to throw around, even by proxy? So I love kind of Grenzo and, like you said, these kinds of low to the ground enchantments and things like that to help facilitate that.
And goading also goes back into those psychological manipulation elements. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
and starts to get back into some of that that what was this? The the warden we were talking about who not the warden, the one who can bribe people.
Yeah,
Guafa.
Gwafa Hazid. Yeah.
So it starts to get into that sort of rattlesnake of, yeah, I'm playing small creatures, but you can't attack
Yeah.
me. That's where um, I've had the question asked to me before: why is it that aggro is so difficult to play? Including decks like so I've seen people try to make the dash deck work.
Yeah, yeah, I've definitely tried.
So my response is, you want to find a way to have your offense become your defense. If you're concerned about your creature going away, then give them lifelink, or have Ikra be one of your commanders, so
Hmm.
that it smacks in, you gain life, and then it comes back. So if your creatures aren't going to be around to block you, at least padded your life total so that you're not in trouble.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think is for a lot of rogues in the way they're designed, and I think frankly a lot of the ways that they're fun to play. These little 1 or 2 drop evasive guys, they can be very board dependent, right? And like you said, you want to make sure that you swinging in isn't just trying to lower their life total. It should also be trying to hopefully further something else or helping you in a different in an additional kind of manner. And again, that for me, that's why I've struggled with Anawan the Ruin Thief in terms of building it in paper, just because I find me milling someone, particularly some of my playgroup members, is only just going to help them. And I feel like if they board wipe me, all I've done is kind of chip away their life total a little bit, fill their graveyard with a lot of like larger threats. And if I haven't happened to draw one of my graveyard hate or exile effects, then I've just helped them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I like the lifelink portion. That's an interesting kind of route. I like that.
Yeah, well, you either add vigilance if you need to. I have a force combat deck that's in Naya colors where one of the major themes of the deck is giving vigilance, so that I don't wind up getting the force combat coming at me.
Yeah, I like that. And I know it's a complicated card because of how it's worded and the way combat works nowadays, but reconnaissance, this 1 mana white enchantment kind of works into that. And I think it also just feels very roguelike, right? You're doing reconnaissance mission. You're trying to gain information and observe and whatnot. I like that kind of idea and how white might be able to kind of actually slot into some aspects of rogues.
Yeah, and you could certainly make a blue-white Guafa rogue deck.
Yeah, the more we've been talking, I'm kind of eyeing that idea. I like it. I've always kind of thought Guffaw Hazid ends up just being kind of a weird, uh, I don't know, pillow forty decks, but I kind of like it under the guise of a even more combat, or maybe institute things like Monarch and other, goad effects that can help kind of facilitate things going your way, which I like.
Yeah. You can start to use some of the hidden abilities that are in cards that you don't usually get to see used properly, like Biden of Thassa. Maybe you could even come
Yeah.
up with some cool idea, like maybe Kiora happened to stop by Bant and traded it with Rafa.
There's some sweet cards out there too that can be used in cool ways like this, like Duelist Heritage, right? This is 2 and a white for an enchantment,
Hmm.
and it's at the beginning of each combat. You can give a creature double strike. Most people are usually putting that in their decks to give their own creature double strike, but you can give opponents' creatures double strike as they,
Hmm.
and you can barter. And I love that kind of political potential where you say, hey, if you don't swing at me, I'll give your guy double strike. That starts to actually, in this kind of shell, that'll facilitate some cool things. You can double up on your saboteur effects with your own rogues, but then you can start to use maybe goaded creatures or something like that to go elsewhere with double strike to also help lower life totals more than you ever probably could on your own combat phase alone.
Yeah, and the Silver Quill deck had a lot of cards that can work like that.
Yeah, you know, I love that deck in particular. I mean, all of them I think were great. I really personally enjoyed the ways in which they kind of expanded our typical ideas of these particular color pairings or guilds into these new schools. But this kind of Orzhov politics goatee thing, I just think was really interesting. And every time we've had Brina or something like that in our group, it's always just facilitated really interesting games, which is what I am still drawn to this format about, is that I want to have things that are interesting, that are dependent sometimes not just on the cards themselves, but the ways in which players and decision making interacts with those cards.
Hmm. Well, that's where unsummons and sign in bloods and such cards that are commons or uncommons that seem unassuming but have major political ramifications are so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have to be, this maybe goes back to our earlier discussion of you were mentioning Sign in Blood. Again, a lot of people just see Sign in Blood or all those effects as, oh, I'm only ever going to use this on myself. But I think a lot of the allure of Commander is the fact that it's multiplayer and kind of changes the rules socially of
Hmm.
how these cards can be used or should be used. You might normally use that just to further yourself in a 1v1 because you're just against one opponent. But now that there's 2 other potential opponents there in a normal 4-player Commander game, things start to get a lot more complex, and there's just a lot more social dynamics at play. And I think our evaluation of cards should change with that to recognize the social component.
The social component that could be an interesting series. Just how many different ways can you use simple cards?
I mean seriously, I think there is a really interesting thing there. I mean, I kind of chat with one of the members in my play group about this larger kind of psychological component is what we use, for lack of a better word, that's what we usually term it. But
Hmm.
things like mill, right? Again, to go back maybe to Anamon or even more specifically, mill-centered decks. Some people are totally fine with it. Other people seem to really have an aversion to being milled.
Hmm.
And it's so interesting because it varies so much from person to person. You might be at the LGS and play with some people, and 2 people are totally fine with you milling them, or just they don't care as much, and some person just might go off. And you never can really predict how
Hmm.
your opponents or people you play with will feel about certain cards or archetypes and things like that.
And then you got to figure out how do you talk to a table about mill, and how do you respond if you are one of those players who does have a graveyard-based deck. It's kind of like the Truth or Dare episode of South Park. South Park. You don't want to appear too eager.
Yeah, it's seriously. I mean, you have decks that you say, "Hey, I'm looking to play my mill deck," and you might have one player be like, okay, fine." Another player who's playing graveyard, like, "Oh, heck yes, go for it." And then one player who just, it's not that mill ruins their deck, but they have an aversion to seeing cards that psychologically you think you were about to draw no longer being drawn, right? And I think that's the psychological component. You can't really quantify that. It's just that affects some people differently than others, and that's what's so tricky about it.
Yeah, there's the element of these cards mean something to me, and I don't like being unable to use them. There's the element of like from earlier, like when a newer players in the game, I don't understand why this is happening, or why I don't
Sure.
get a chance to use them.
Yeah.
There can be the element of I want to see how my deck functions, and milling key elements of the deck isn't showing me how it functions.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? That's a totally kind of understandable um, kind of reaction, I would say, to seeing these kinds of cards milled. And you've taken time to slot these cards in the deck. It's a 100 card singleton deck. There's a lot of variance,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to see how different cards work. And if the one game you were finally going to draw that card you slotted in 3 weeks ago to see how it's performed just suddenly gets milled, and you have no way of accessing that, it could be like, oh, I got to wait for another game, to be able to see how this thing works.
Yeah, sometimes you think something's in your deck and you realize it isn't, and you're like, oh, now I'm just screwed, aren't
Yeah,
I?
yeah. And to go back to maybe some of the kind of reach that rogues can have, and the cool the variability that they can kind of offer outside of just combat. I think one of the kind of other really cool commanders, and this is one I would love to do. I just over webcam, it's so difficult. Is Gonti, Lord of Luxury,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and I think it's a perfect kind of rogue design and card, right? It's not necessarily sneaky, but it's extortive, and you can tell there's just this kind of lavish aura about the area that Gonti's in, and this ability is so interesting and kind of cryptic. And I've seen so many players who have gotten Gonti start to kind of sweat. Well, what did they take? Was it something really good, or is there a mind game going on there? There's just so much interesting stuff that comes out of what is really a very, in my opinion, clean design. And I like that it's a rogue in that case, and I think it offers something very rogue-like.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It can be taken in a variety of different directions, and it's cool to see how they use um, how they yeah, it can be sneaky, but they can also be manipulative.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It's not just covert; it can be blatant, but the
Mm-hmm.
way they do it is, like you said, more manipulative or even extortive in some cases.
Yeah, it's neat to see how they can sort of dip into different colors. Green is a little bit more of a stretch, but that
Yeah,
can be more like almost like a druid rogue, where they're using nature as camouflage rather than nature as like inherent power.
sure. Yeah,
You think
yeah. It's
about
an
cards like
interesting idea. It's
Gigantomancer.
mechanically maybe, and I know that this card is not green by any means, but Kelsian the Plague, which was from
Hmm.
Ikoria, as the Mardu kind of human, I think, assassin
Yeah.
with experience counters. Again, mechanically, everything, strike that kind of from memory, but artistically, that's kind of what I think about when you say like this kind of roguish figure using nature as a form of camouflage. My brain immediately went to Kelsian, because that art is so kind of interesting in that way. It feels very imbued and hidden in this kind of nature-esque and I get that that's part of just the
Hmm.
plane in Ikoria and humans versus dinosaurs or monsters. I get that, but that's kind of what came to mind, and I like that idea.
Yeah, I think about like in Naruto, the ninjas running through the trees with their arms behind them and such.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Uh, and maybe it could be more in maybe green, but I think this blue white. You've got me really thinking about this blue white rogue
Yeah.
potential of it's kind of like you said, you silver tongued devil, you devilish rogue, right?
Yeah.
Like this kind of sweet talker rogue.
Hmm.
And I like that kind of idea of having this roguish behavior or archetype that's not just about not exclusively skulking through the streets and pickpocketing or something, but working in the higher echelons of maybe a particular plane or society, but being able to use their kind of wit and linguistic charm to kind of maneuver through scenarios.
Hmm.
And translating that mechanically, I get as a big ask, but I'm excited at that potential.
And is that any less underhanded? Just because they happen to be upfront about it and out in the open about it. Is it any less underhanded?
Yeah, perfect. Great way to put it. Yeah.
But for somebody who's but staying completely above board, I very much respect you and the articles that you come up with. You are a wonderful, wonderful writer. Uh, so to remind the people who you are.
I am Trent, and thanks for that, man. I really appreciate it. That means a lot.
Absolutely. Been following along EDA Trek for a while before I got called up to the majors, I guess.
Well, we're so glad to have you on board. I speak for myself, but I bet everyone else, and especially since you've just produced so much content in such a small amount of time since joining. We appreciate you kind of picking up a lot of slack on some of our schedules and whatnot, and you've been crushing it.
Absolutely. I'm ambitious and I work hard. If nothing else, granted, there's the talent part too, but more ambitious and work hard.
It shows, man. It shows.
Thank you. So where can people find your content?
Yeah, so you can find my content over at edatrek.com. Again, the series I write now is called Reconstruct History, looking at different cards and archetypes over time, really looking at the last 2 years and popularity trends. And you can check out my older series, Evasive Maneuvers, which has concluded until we get a new evasive mechanic. But that looked at different keywords and types of evasion and how we might be able to kind of adapt it into Commander, and each with their own kind of, I would say, try to have a unique brew that went with that, or deck build that went with that particular keyword.
I suppose it's a good thing you brought up Skulk then.
I did have a Skulk deck. It was, I don't know how effective it is, but it's something I always circle back to. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I still wish they had done that with Rogues, because that to me is a way of limiting their unblockability and highlighting the size, especially since they brought him back around Ikoria. That would have been hilarious.
I mean, how cool would it be too, right? With things like Meekstone, these kinds of cards that suddenly alter the board state to say if you're greater than, a certain power, you are punished for that. And that kind of fits in line with Skulk. There's a really cool card I love that I've been kind of trying out in a couple different decks called Noetic Scales.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 4-mana artifact, and I think it says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player returns all creatures they control with power greater than the number of cards in their hand. So it really rewards kind of small creatures. And so those would all kind of fit in this skulky shell that's rewarding.
Can you guess what my favorite part of that card is?
What?
Returns to the owner's hand.
Unsummoned, yes, of course.
Yeah, I actually have a mono red unsummoned deck. It's this I call it Wheels because it's Adamaru. He's a colorless and 2 red. His power and toughness are equal to the greatest cards in hand among opponents.
Okay.
So if they're bouncing anything big to their hands, or trying to maintain large amounts of cards in hand in order to keep their creatures around, he's going to stay big.
Yeah, that's sweet. I like that. That's a cool kind of area for that.
And then one of the cool things I like to do with bounce effects and wheel effects is if something goes back into the hand that I really don't want to see them recast, like say Avacyn, I then wheel it away.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Sting Scourger, bounce Avacyn, wheel it away.
Yeah, let's get that out of there. I was joking, I think, on our Discord not too long ago that I haven't ever gotten around to it, but I keep having this idea I really want to have of and this is based on like an old, from what I understand, kind of janky deck that when I was first learning how to play as a kid, some of our camp instructors were playing, and they were the ones who taught us. And there was this kind of renowned blue-black prison deck that was based around enchantments. And this was back probably 60-card one-on-one format. So I don't know how well it translates, but I think I remember one of the cards being Warped Devotion, which is 2 and a black, an enchantment. Whenever a card
so
or
hard to make
permanent
that work.
a permanent is returned to its owner's hand, they discard a card. And so it's pretty brutal, and it could be a bit prison-y, but it just seems such an interesting place for like a blue-black tempo deck, where I'm tempoing people's creatures, and using Mana War becomes backbreaking at that point, and it just seems so cool. And like, I don't know if it would work at EDH. I don't know, you'd have to have like a group that's maybe conducive to playing against that, but it just seemed like a kind of interesting, neat idea.
I have it in my my Spectre tribal deck actually.
Sorry, which deck?
I have a Spectre tribal deck.
Ah, okay, yeah. It seems a great place for that. Yeah.
Yep, and I use that with Noetic Scales as well.
Do you use Larceny in there by chance?
I don't recall. I haven't played with the deck in a while, but I don't think so, because I don't want to do that with effects outside. I don't want to make opponents discard with effects outside of the Spectres themselves.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think I remember Larceny being printed when I was a kid, like alongside a lot of these other Spectre. That was like 8th edition or something. And I think I remember it being printed in like a core set deck or something with Spectres. And it was, I mean, if you resolved both, a Spectre with Larceny out, it started to get pretty brutal.
What I wound up doing, I call the deck Inspector Gadget, and I have the swords in there. Just about as many swords as I can throw into the deck.
That's awesome. That's funny.
Because they already trigger when they deal combat damage, so
why
not
So
trigger that?
Yeah. And this is maybe it's somewhat related to Rogues, and you just said with the gadget part reminded me of this. When they came out with one of the unsets, I forget which one, maybe Unstable, but when they came out with the whole sneak, idea in Silver Border, I just thought it was so cool. I love the idea of having a spy creature type, and they having like Phoebe, Head of Sneak, is like still a card I always come back to, and I think my group would be okay if I rule 0 to as long as the 99 was still black bordered. But it's just a cool concept, and I love the kind of Inspector Gadgety art on a lot of those sneak cards, and how the spies have these kind of weird accordion arms and magnifying like massive glasses and telescopes and whatnot. It was just fun.
Well, it would make sense to have something that has sneak and is able to attack if you're playing rogues.
Right, exactly.
D&D.
Yeah.
Sneak attack.
Yeah, I remember that confusing, because that was the name for the precon, for the rogue precon, which Anawan, the Ruined Thief, was featured in. And I remember a lot of people being, and myself included, being like, sneak attack, but it's not red. You always think of the red enchantment, right?
Yep.
But, yeah. Well, thanks again for having me on. I don't know if there's any other kinds of rogue-like stuff. I think we kind of hit a lot of it.
Yeah, we've exhausted a lot of it, but thank you very much for being on. It's been wonderful to talk about rogues with you. Wonderful to talk with you in general.
My pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And if there's ever another type that you would want to come back on and talk about, feel free to reach out.
For sure. Yeah, I got some other ideas I'll maybe touch base with you in the future on. It'd be fun to do this again.
Sounds good. Thank you. Have a great day.
Likewise. You too.